All right. Um, I do appreciate the chance to have these folks here, and I hope some more people come back in from lunch very soon because this is a real treat to me that we were able to get these folks to come from the West Coast to share their experiences. Why would we do that? Because this first came out of actually the hospitality of the folks on the West Coast. PCSGA, Margaret Pilaro is on the panel. I'll introduce her in a minute. She and the board invited Brian Rackley, one of our founding board members, to come out and speak as the keynote speaker. Scared the crap out of me that he had no slides for a 45-minute talk, but he killed it. It was great. So Brian was invited out, and then Beth was invited out also, I think, to come and speak about the server training program, and I just tagged along. But it was a very warm welcome, and it was great because not only was there that the ability to share our information, but just meeting people over those drinks, talking with those people, seeing them in the trade show, it just felt like we were learning a lot. And I will say my personal experience has been, it is amazing to me how parochial shellfish aquaculture is because it's risky. So you do what you've seen somebody else do that works. And you typically see the people around you. And so I took a class of graduate students out, and we went to a bunch of different places on the West Coast and saw a bunch of hatcheries. And it was so cool that I sent a couple of folks, actually, Lauren, are you here? Lauren might not be back yet. Lauren and Haley, we sent them out to go visit West Coast hatcheries, partly because just go see how somebody else does this. Just go take another look. And we now have actually adopted a couple things at the hatchery at VIMS based on those visits. So there is that value. The other idea is just, it's very different aquaculture, but there are some similarities and there's some things to learn. When you think about some of the lessons learned, we're a young but growing industry in the South, and the West Coast industry has been around for a while. So there's some things to learn from where they are now that we maybe could apply. So I'm going to introduce, let's see. So I'm going to start with Amanda and Plausch and Carr. Is it Plausch and Carr? It's not Plauché, sorry. My French is terrible. Plauché and Carr were kind enough to help sponsor this. So Amanda, I'll let you introduce yourself. And I want you can tell us your name, company, and location. But I also want to know your favorite thing to do in your job and what you probably would have done if you weren't involved in Shellfish.
You got it. Okay, is this on?
Yeah.
All right, good afternoon. Yeah, I'm Amanda Carr with Plauché and Carr. It's a law firm that's based in Seattle, Washington, where I'm based. We also have an office in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. My law partner, Megan, who runs that office as an attorney. And
So if you weren't involved in
Yeah,
shellfish
sure.
aquaculture, what would your work be?
I think I would love to have an independent bookstore. That's what my parents did, and they owned one for 26 years. So that's my backup dream job.
That's great. All right, let's see. I've got Bill next. Sorry, this is just the order that the slides are in.
Hi, all. I'm Bill Dewey. I'm Director of Public Affairs for Taylor Shellfish Farms in Washington State. So big family operation. They started back in 1890 and are major producers of manila clams, mussels, geoduck, and oysters, lots of oysters. Big operation, vertically integrated hatcheries, nurseries, farms, processing. We have our own restaurants. We distribute all over the world. And I do policy work for them in my public affairs position. So policy and regulatory work, that's where I play, in legislature and Congress, et cetera. A lot of focus on water quality, public health regulations that we need. Favorite part of my job is actually not my job. I have a shellfish farm of my own I do on the side where I grow manila clams and geoduck. That's my good space. That's where I love to be, and it keeps me grounded in why I do what I do for tailors in the industry and the policy arena.
And if that hadn't worked out, what would you do?
I've never thought of that. I never had any desire to do anything different. I've been doing it for 40 years, and I look forward to every day of work.
Love it. All right, John. I think I did this alphabetically.
Yeah, so I'm John Finger, founder and CEO of Hog On Oyster Company. So we are in California, not as big as Taylor, but we're also vertically integrated. We have our own hatchery, nursery, and farm in Humboldt Bay, and our original farm in Tamales Bay, which is about an hour north of San Francisco. And we've got now 5 restaurant locations, and the company got to be bigger than I ever thought it would be. Didn't actually want to ever have a big company, but one thing leads to another, and we've been at it this long. So my favorite thing to do, I spend most of my time now in an office on the phone or on the computer and remote meetings and stuff is really getting out in the bay and just walking the beds and, feeling the tide coming in and the day changing and, spending a few hours out in the bay. That's still why I got into this business and still my favorite part of this business. And yeah, I have no idea what I would do. I mean, probably not work. I would surf and fish, and that would be about it.
Surf and fish more.
Fish
Right,
more,
yeah,
yeah.
okay. All right, now I've lost the screen. You working on that? Got you. All right, so alphabetically, Jesse, your picture's not up there, but Jesse Honiker is next from Hama.
Hi, I'm Jessie Honiker. I work for Hama Hama Oyster Company. We're a mid-sized farm located in Washington State on the Hood Canal. And we have a restaurant and a retail store, but we are also a timber farm. So very natural resource focused for our specific area. And my title, I'm the farm and nursery operations manager. We don't talk about titles a lot at the farm, but and so my focus really is on inventory management for our farms and also the nursery end. My favorite thing to do is I think the best thing about farming is just the physical gratification of being able to see yourself get a lot of stuff done. So if there's any time that we show up on a beach with just a lot of seed in the boat, and then at the end of the day, it's just beautifully organized onto the farm, that is like, it just scratches my brain in the perfect way. And then I think in terms of what I would be doing if I wasn't shellfish farming is I would be doing another type of farming. So my background, I do have a degree in agriculture and I love dairy farming too. Organic dairies are kind of similar in some ways because it's all about feed utilization rates. So oysters are kind of like the ruminants of the sea.
Love it. Love it. All right, Bobbi, you're next.
All right, that works out pretty
I
good.
can't count, but I can alphabetize.
Okay, good. I'm not sure I can do either. So I'm Bobbi Hudson. I am the executive director of a group called the Pacific Shellfish Institute. We work all along the West Coast, but we're based in Washington State in Olympia, side by side with the Pacific Coast Shellfish Growers Association. So I think I just said we've been around for 30 years, but a private nonprofit institution to do work on behalf of the needs of shellfish farmers. So we obtain funding from largely federal grants from NOAA and USDA, but also state private foundations doing education and outreach, but also applied research related to shellfish farming needs. There are 9 staff, mainly biologists. Ecology is sort of our focus area. And the favorite part of my job is definitely meetings like this and meeting with people, and folks that know me can usually find me at the bar at the end of the night. So it's not just that, not just drinking with folks.
Facts, by the way.
But I really, really enjoy connecting people and information. In my job as an administrator, I kind of get to be the jack of all trades and engage with a lot of people. Pacific Shellfish Institute, we collaborate with academic institutions, with farms, with other NGOs. And so I really love that, connecting people and information. And I'm certainly not an expert at any one thing. So I just thrive off of that. If I wasn't in this job, I'm not sure what I would do. I've been doing it for 10 years as director and 20 years at the organization. Maybe fishing. My dad was a commercial fisherman, and I always thought growing up and through my late teenage, early 20s, I kept going back seasonally to do fishing in Alaska. So I think maybe I'd be doing that. Yeah. But anyway.
I will say Beth and I were coming back to our room last night, and we were thinking, okay, we got to get talks ready. Bobbi's going down to the bar, invited us down for a nightcap. We wisely chose not to, I think. Next time. All right, so Margaret.
Hello, everyone. I'm Margaret Pilaro. I'm the executive director of the Pacific Coast Shellfish Growers Association. That association has been around in one form or another since about 1930. So it started as just an Olympia Oyster Growers Association, moved to West Coast or Pacific Coast Oyster Growers, and now we represent shellfish growers who do bivalves, so oysters, mussels, clams, and a giant burrowing clam called the gooey duck. And if you don't know about the gooey duck, we can talk about it later. Probably at the bar is more appropriate, but so I've been lucky enough to be with the association in two different versions. I'm now in 2.0, but I started back in 2010. And the association, we have about 100 farms, tribal and non-tribal farms. Most of our farms are very small memberships, and we're membership based, so they're very small farms. But we do have some of the largest ones. And so we're always trying to balance all the disparity between all the big and the small and the rural and the not so rural and all of those things. So that's what I mostly do during the day. My favorite part is actually being with all of you as shellfish growers, particularly in your favorite places, which are your farms. It's just awe-inspiring to, especially when it's a multi-generational farm like we have on the West Coast, to know that the farmer is operating in the same space that their great-great-grandparents operated, and that that the success of their farm is really tied to their family. And that's really inspiring. If I were not doing this, I mean, I came to this from working in public engagement, but there's no question, if I were not here as the executive cat herder for the PCSJ, I would be Ina Garden, foodie extraordinaire, baker of all good things. So that's clearly what I would do.
Love it. I love it. All right, and then we wrap up with Miranda.
Hi, everyone. My name's Miranda Ries, and I'm a fourth-generation shellfish farmer, born and raised in Washington State. I have also had the privilege of working on behalf of a larger company that surpassed the entirety of the West Coast, and like some of these folks on the stage, had hatcheries and processing plants and the whole array. Being a fourth-generation shellfish farmer, I tell folks it's a part of the fabric of who I am. I cut my teeth and learned how to walk on a shellfish farm. I've done all the proverbial jobs and somehow found passion working in the policy and regulatory environment. Some people say I need medication, but it's good work. And when you can accomplish that good work for the betterment of an industry that's going to make it more sustainable and more attainable. I have two children, and my son works on our family farm. He has a 2-year-old daughter. And so to think about the 5th generation using this as the way he's taking care of his family and raising the potential 6th generation, it's what keeps me going. Seeing my mom work hard, she's one of the hardest working people I've ever met. It's an inspiration. And so my favorite thing, and earlier presentation, one of the hints was, who are your 3 people you would call? And I was really fortunate and blessed to just look to the left and look to the right. And I had my executive director of my Growers Association, a fellow farmer, and an attorney. And it doesn't make sense to people that aren't oyster farmers, but everyone in this room understands, like, those are your people. When things happen, and they do, when you run out of gas, you get a nasty letter in the mail, or you have a hearing to go to. This really is a community that makes up the fabric of who we are. And if I wasn't a shellfish farmer, which is just a crazy, unimaginable thought, I would be a photographer for National Geographic and explore the ocean.
That's great. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask them some questions. They sent some slides, some pictures of the West Coast, but we're just going to let those auto-rotate so you can see some pictures, some scenes from the West Coast. So when we open up for questions, if there's something that really grabs your eye about that, well, we can go back to that slide, or you can ask. But I really want to start with the importance of making the tide on the West Coast was driven home to me with a visit on the West Coast when my class was running a little bit late to Bill Dewey's farm. I wrote in here that intertidal culture is the predominant form of shellfish aquaculture on the West Coast. And that's probably not true for a lot of growers in the South. So for the shellfish growers on the panel, could you sort of describe what a typical day, workday on the farm is?
I'll get started and then leave it to my other colleagues that probably spend way more time on the farm. But as the saying goes, time and tide wait for no man. And on the West Coast, we have very extreme tides. They can exchange about 20 plus feet in any given day. The farm I was born and raised on a good -4 tide, will go dry a mile straight out. And then working on the coastal estuary, it's much different. But predominantly ground culture oysters are still the leading type of culture method. And so it is a lot of boots on the ground. So riding on a boat, getting out there. I apologize for this severity of what I'm about to say, but my grandfather has said all he wants to see is assholes and elbows. So bent over, filling the bushel basket, dumping it in there, and then getting yourself back to the dock, and then letting the big boats go out and pick it all up and getting it into the processing plant. And it changes every day, right? So right now we're just coming out of night tides. So work is being done by headlamp. And so folks right now that work on farms are really excited because they don't have, that incessant line across their forehead. And so, let's see, John, Bill. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, we're similar, as Miranda mentioned, the tides are important. The 2 bays we operate in don't have as severe tides, or either a 6-foot range or a 9-foot range. And it's really every other week that you have a really good tide series in terms of being able to get out and if things go dry and do work. But you're also looking at these tides that are good for harvesting, right? We all have really shallow draft boats. You can carry a lot of weight, can get into a foot of water or less. So it's timing is everything in terms of getting out and harvesting. Harvesting on a dropping tide is always dodgy. We've all gotten boats stuck out there. That's kind of what it looks like. So it's that literally that ebb and flow between the weeks and between the work you've got planned, planning your work. When is it good for harvesting? When is it good to actually get work accomplished out there, week in and week out? So.
I think you guys have captured it. That tide moves about 45 minutes a day for us. So your shift changes 45 minutes every day. Then you get a break, maybe depending on the depth of your farm, you maybe get 4 days off between tide series and you start it all over again. As Miranda said, 6 months out of the year, we're doing that in the middle of the night. So from September to March, we don't see our farms in the daylight. It's all by headlamp. And then we all look forward to April when it swings back around, get to work in the daylight. Essentially April through September.
For a little context, at Hama, we have about 250 acres that just completely disappears when the tide's in. And then when the tide's out, we have all access to all that. But during the different times of the month, there's sort of tidal extremes. So this whole month, we really haven't been able to get out to certain parts of our farm. So it's also planning month by month the sort of maintenance that you're going to do, because there just are times of the year where there's not low enough tides to access certain portions of your farm. There's a lot of pictures of barges on here, and that's a majority of how we're doing our harvesting. So people are going out onto the beach and containerizing product, and then we're using boats to actually pull that in. We have a flow-through wet storage on our uplands that allows us to store product that's coming off the tide and allow us to more easily access it during times when the tide isn't good for going out and harvesting it. So it's a lot of logistics and thinking ahead around the tides.
I'm just curious, with that title change, are the people who work for you pretty much married to the job? Because that seems to me like it would be very difficult to have another job with that changing time all the time and the night tides.
Pretty much so. Yeah, my personal farm's a part-time farm, so people have other work. I just try to get a lot of people, so any one day I can get a full group of part-time people. And it isn't all intertidal, but we do floating culture as well. Our mussel farms are floating more and more. At least our company, Taylor's, are transitioning to floating oyster culture. So you're seeing a bit of a shift there. Excited about that because we get away from the night tides and mechanize some of the systems. So, but the bottom culture, has been by and large the long history of the industry, and you've seen some pictures of it, is growing these heavy clusters and then shucking those clusters for meat. It's been a shuck meat industry for many, many decades, and really only in the last 30 years, kind of following that resurgence in the raw bar trade to pursue the specialty oysters.
Anybody else want to comment on the seeing what I call off bottom culture, the suspended or floating oyster culture, what you've seen on the West Coast?
Yeah, I think, oyster culture in general is still relatively young in the United States. And even though the West Coast has well over 100 years under its belt, it's still a constant evolution. And when you pair that with changing ocean conditions, changing regulatory environments, things like that, it forces the hand and it forces us to evolve, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, thinking about, off-bottom oysters and the beautiful morsels that have been created by using different structures, whether it be SEPA or flip farm. We just create these really beautiful animals that are such a delight. But it hasn't always been that way. I think the reasons why we change techniques, it's for a variety of reasons. We have issues with invasive species, where we've lost substrate that is adequate to growing shellfish. And so it's really forced folks to think outside of the box, working on things like labor force. I mean, labor force is really a challenge. And so working towards things that can be mechanized, I think is a big reason behind some of those things. And then just the market demand, the shucked market, while it's still healthy, it is, somewhat on a decline. And that just speaks to the consumer and what the consumer is looking for. And that's more of a half shell oyster.
The only other thing that I would say about sort of surface culture, which we're doing at Hama now too, with Flip Farm and SEPA, is that our lines still go dry. So we're still working around the tide with them. And that's not true for every lease, but it is for ours. But the other thing is, I mean, we heard that lovely presentation this morning where they were talking about resistance towards different types of farming. And we are seeing a lot of resistance towards surface culture. And I mean, Bill can speak to that so much more than I can, but there's a fear of people hitting the surface culture lines with boats or whale entanglement. So we're kind of fighting that a little bit.
That actually leads into, I was going to ask about policy and I would say certainly in Virginia, for example, which has a traditional culture of subtidal culture, we've seen with some of the off-bottom stuff, we've seen different responses to the public to that. So in the southern U.S. generally, though, off-bottom oyster aquaculture is relatively new. So you have a long history. Do you think that history affects your policies and social acceptance? That people know about shellfish farming in the West Coast?
Not really.
Yeah, I would just say it's a constant evolution. And as we see people move more to living their lives close to the salt water, which I can appreciate because it speaks to me as well. We just have more people. And so, with more people come more opinions. And so we have established shellfish farms that have been around for a century. And then you have someone that comes from a cityscape and they are looking for peace and serene, landscape. And all of a sudden, they don't like that you were there because that impacts their perception of what peace and serenity looks like. And so it's a constant education and it's a constant need for us to be present in telling our stories, because often those stories are what speak to people, not the science and the facts, which is a bit frustrating, but it's the reality.
Anyway, go ahead, Bill.
In California, I always thought it was the opposite for me because there wasn't this long history. I came from the East Coast where, shellfish, fishing was the basis of the culture. And so we had to, from the get-go, spend a lot of time with education, educating people. And that became part of what we did from the beginning, teaching people what we're doing and how we were doing it. And I will say, as we see more and more people get into these techniques of growing oysters, it's something we need to be mindful of, is that it's much more gear intensive than it used to be. And that's sort of our Achilles heel in managing that and making sure, again, we got ahead of this by getting involved in community beach cleanups well before we had a lot of gear out there to make sure that we were part of that conversation about the marine debris in general. So something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, just building off of Miranda's comment, I think two things that I feel like I've seen have been really helpful in terms of keeping that message of the history alive. One is having some sort of, third-party validation or statement, recognition of that history that people can point to, that's sort of an external source, folks in leadership, at the state, other places. So that it's not just the growers saying, hey, we've been here a long time. It's people that are kind of, keepers of the history of the place. And then also just, I think, Pacific Coast growers are really great at community festivals. So there's a lot of, particularly places that have that history, just a tradition of having these shellfish focused community festivals. And I think that's a really helpful way to keep that, that history and that tradition alive and in the forefront of people's minds.
I was just going to comment that it kind of varies by region. In Willapa Bay, it's a 100-plus-year history out there as part of the fabric of the community. And you don't see the opposition out there that you do in southern Puget Sound. It's become more urbanized around traditional shellfish farming areas. And we've adopted some new culture techniques that are more visible, or you got floating, and that's, you go to the surface, that's where your opposition occurs. But it's pretty interesting, so Mason County, where tailors are based, the shellfish industry collectively is the second largest private employer. It's a resource-based county. We recently had a permit, trying to get a farm permitted for floating surface bags. It's a 50-acre lease, and very controversial, and very interesting to see the social media debate on that, as people that are new to the area because they got high-speed internet and COVID drove them out to rural shorelines where they could afford homes on the shoreline. And lots of vocal opposition, and then all the people that have lived there, part of the resource-based industry, say, oh, no, wait a minute, you don't realize how significant this industry is. So it's kind of balanced, almost 50-50 in social media as people came to our defense. So it really varies by region.
Yeah. All right. Well, then, I guess for Bobbi, you can lead this on. What are some of the top research priorities on the West Coast? You do a lot of research. So what are some of the top research priorities, and how do you all identify what research you prioritize?
All right, well, I'll let Margaret talk about the research priorities, but we've been talking about policy, and just an example of one of the kinds of things that my institution works on is the floating culture and even long lines, and the impacts and coexistence of oyster culture with eelgrass, which is a protected species because it's essential fish habitat. So my shop we went out and got $1.8 million to look at that issue and build on the research that's available so that regulators have the information that they want to know about potential impacts, and then other species that are utilizing these habitats, so we can demonstrate the habitat that it does provide, but also really understand light attenuation through the farms, those kinds of things. So it is those issues at I would say, the intersection of farming and policy that Pacific Shellfish Institute works on.
Thank you, Bobbi. That's good lead in. And I think I'll start my comments with a call out to all of you. I mean, your research component is a huge part of your success. And PCSGA now does a research priorities assessment to understand what it is that growers are dealing with, what is it that they need to learn more about, where does that policy intersect with the research, and try to articulate those. Now we're doing them every other year, and then share that information with those people who are funding research or conducting research, who are, wanting to build that sort of the literature behind what it is that's happening out there. And so I think for this year, we're doing our 25-27 priorities. Why does stuff die? Right? We don't really get to talk so much about climate so much anymore, because we're worried that that's going to really kind of not receive the attention that we know it needs. But stuff is dying. And is it because there's not enough food? Why is there not enough food? At what point are they dying? What kinds of things? And so those are important. And that means that you kind of want to know what's happening at your farm. So looking for information site specific. What does that look like? Who are these technological wizards who can help get that information to the farm? I've always said that, 100 years ago, shellfish farmers would get their rain gear if it was raining, and they'd go out when the tide was low. Now they take their phone out, they look at all the data that they need to know about whether they're going to be harvesting or transplanting or waiting because of the information that's coming through. So those are areas where we need more research. We need more research in what the heck is going on with all these harmful algal blooms. What kinds of testing do we need? How do we open these areas back up again? Another thing, because we are now much more structure related to shellfish farming, what do you do with your stuff when it's out of life? Like, where's a recycling? The folks that are making these materials, we have to start thinking about what happens when they're done. And so those are some areas, monitoring, impacts on the life of these animals, interactions with other species, how they relate to other policies. Those are some of our big research items.
I can throw it open to the audience at this point, I think, and see some questions. I've got some questions that some people had sent me, but does anybody here in the room have some questions for these folks or comments?
Hi, Jim Mine. I'm with Oyster Hatchery in Texas called Palacios Marine Agricultural Research. And we are the last coast to adopt aquaculture. And so we have a lot of new farmers, some of whom are here today. And a question that has come up to me frequently is concerns about, well, how big is the market demand for oysters? And I had the great pleasure of touring Taylor Shellfish with Bill Dewey, and was sort of blown away by just the production capacity that is in the Pacific Northwest. And I think it'd be really helpful maybe to share with the audience just how big you are and your thoughts on, how big is the demand for effectively this half shell market.
It's,
Who's that direction?
I was gonna say, it's a tough question, and I would say the West Coast, similar to other regions, we have the very small operations. We have the very small guys that are operating on a quarter or half an acre. I came from an operation that had 17,000 acres spanned across the West Coast. And so it's a question we constantly are asking ourselves. And I think the answer is we have to open more pathways outside of the US, and we have to do more education to demand that our products be recognized for the healthy source of protein that they are. In addition to the other good work that farming oysters produces for the environment. But we need to, there's enough room for all of us. This world needs all of us to grow more oysters. And so finding those market opportunities is a huge piece of making that happen. I don't know that us on the West Coast could tell you what the market's doing or why it's doing that. We all want the stability, but I will say that an educated oyster consumer eats more.
While I
oyster.
was frustrated that, the sustainable seafood movement was all about other things besides bivalve models. And I'm like, what the hell? And I think that started shifting a little bit. We saw that, I'd say, like 7 years ago, where there's a shift where more and more people were realizing what a great source of animal protein this was. And we saw that building the demand a little bit. So I think it's continuing to do that. Like, you can't produce animal protein more sustainable than this. And that's the message.
Any other questions out there? I think you got one back there.
Jordan Lynch with Key Allegro Oyster Company. See some pretty big wet storage systems up there in the pictures. And I know, Jesse, you mentioned one. Just kind of curious how important those are to your guys' operations, how many operations out there are using wet storage. Just kind of curious about that. We're interested in exploring it in Texas. So just kind of curious.
Yeah, so the pictures of the big systems that you're seeing there are systems that Taylor's has built in the last few years here. And a driving factor for that was trying to address the Vibrio perihemolyticus problem. And the post-harvest process methods that are out there don't work really well for half-shell oysters. They all result in a dead oyster, and we're serving live raw oysters in the oyster bar. So you're trying to find that silver bullet to get rid of the Vibrio and get a safe oyster. And through research with Oregon State University and our own on-site research, realized that holding them at a certain temperature, they'll purge the majority of that Vibrio in 24 hours. And since we've been using those systems, we haven't had any single source illnesses from our oysters. So it's really important from that standpoint for our company. We've shared that data and a number of different presentations. I think you're seeing more and more companies thinking about putting them in. They're scalable. You know, you don't have to build that monster system that you saw on the slide. You buy systems that are tote based and scalable, temperature controlled systems that'll do the exact same thing. But wet storage has been a big part of our industry forever. You know, a lot of times it's done differently. It can be done in floats out on in the bay and approved growing areas. It can be done on the beach. You got to get wet storage permits from our State Department of Health, but it's always been an important component. But now for us, based on the Vibrio, much more important component. And as we've done it for Vibrio, we've recognized all sorts of ancillary benefits as well. Inventory control, being able to meet those last minute orders since you have the product on site, product quality. You can meet your interstate temperature shipping protocols with that product alive in water instead of days in the cooler to get it down to temperature, et cetera, or icing it and shocking it. So there's lots of different benefits to it beyond just the Vibrio.
You know, we got involved in Dewey. I think we built our first one in 1988 for a different reason. We have rainfall closures in Tomales Bay where we can't harvest if it, you know, rains too much, and you get back rainfall closures. You can be closed for weeks at a time. So we built a wet storage system. We're able to harvest ahead of storms, hold the animals in the wet storage system. And then realized once we were doing that, it led to a bunch of different things. We're on Highway 1 in California. We have oysters live in tanks. We can open up the gates. People can stop by and buy oysters, and, you know, led to the growth of our retail business. And then the quality assurance thing that Bill is talking about is really the other offshoot that we now, year round, anything we harvest goes into our wet storage system for 24 hours before we sell it. We've actually got 2 systems, and it's just that added quality assurance, you know, safety and UV sterilized, treated water, really does a lot to make sure that we've got really good quality, safe product going to market.
Yeah, we're coming off of a kind of a traumatic Vibrio or neurovirus season. I'm sorry. And I think in terms of demand, we've just seen a lot of articles in the New York Times related to oysters and getting people sick. And I think that the number one thing we can kind of do for the industry is just try to lessen the amount that the media is talking about, like, don't eat oysters, they're making you sick. And we're investing in some smaller systems. They're called Agalsa-based tote-based systems that are essentially smaller versions of what Taylor's doing. And it's the major investment that we're making this year and pouring quite a bit of money into it.
Just a quick follow-up on that, Bill. Jesse mentioned the norovirus, which is also an interest to us. We've had some issues with that, particularly it's like an annual occurrence for our farms in British Columbia where they don't do as good a job treating sewage up there. And the wet storage systems are essentially depuration systems. They have all the same technology in them that you would in a depuration plant, but viruses don't depurate like the Vibrio bacteria. So it's a longer time in holding to really eliminate any norovirus risk. That said, even the few days we're holding it in wet storage, it's obviously reducing that risk of a virus illness.
I know we might have more questions, but the 3-minute tech talks come up, and I know they're nervous speakers for that. So I did ask the panelists to wrap up with, and, you know, based on what you've seen and where the West Coast industry is now, what's one piece of advice, warning, suggestions that you might have for the Oyster South community? I'll start with Amanda, I guess. Sorry, you were ready.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm going to put in a shameless plug for oyster organizations. Oyster South, PCSJ, ECSJ. I do represent PCSJ, so full disclosure, but just from a regulatory and policy perspective, seeing the ability of folks to kind of come together and coordinate and strategize on those issues and get out ahead of them.
Work, but listen, Adam, who are 5th generation farmers at Hama, have done a lot of work on building the brand of Hama. And I think that brand building is kind of the most important thing that you can do. The best value added product that you have is that oyster coming off the tide right then, right there. hitting that half shell market. And from there, you can add to your product line that really means something about your farm. We have a lot of compound butters or different value added products that we're doing. But really, if you can make people really attached to the story of your oyster, it's easier to sell.
Yeah, and I'm going to echo what Amanda said. Networking with other farmers and events like this are so important. I get to do a fair amount of work up in Alaska, and they have a small but growing oyster industry. And in doing that, there's constantly questions that I get year after year after year from new farms. It's like, we'll talk to each other. And by the way, come down to Washington or Oregon and go to the Pacific Coast Shellfish Growers Association meeting and network with farmers there, because you can learn so much from each other.
So I realize this is Oyster South and an oyster meeting, and this may not be an option for many people just because of your location, but consider diversification instead of just growing oysters. So I attribute Taylor's success to the fact that we are so diverse, species diverse with oysters, clams, mussels, and geoduck, market diverse. We sell throughout the country. We sell locally. We sell in our oyster bars. We export product. We got diverse markets. And geographically diverse, so you don't have all your eggs in one basket in one bay. So if you get a red tide or a pollution closure, you got other areas to fill your markets.
Thanks, Bill.
One piece of advice I would offer is to just be involved. As the saying goes, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so really getting engaged in things, participating in these conferences, critically important. But participating in different things, which are brutal and time consuming and expensive, but like ISSC and your local regional meetings, just making sure, because, you know, associations and board members, we take our roles and responsibilities, you know, very strongly. But if we don't know what you're doing or why you're doing what you're doing, we can't ensure that we're representing you and taking your interest into account. So just being present, being heard, and to the extent that you can, also investing in the next generation. You may not be able to change the hearts and minds of people that have their minds made up, but a good opportunity to get into the school systems and things like that and make a connection to the growing minds.
So yeah, I'd even reiterate what Bill said, but in addition to that is go slow. You know, we have a saying in the company that, you know, this is a business that will kill you with potential. You know, and you can get over your skis in a hurry. And, you know, even when we talk about the quality of our oyster, we talk about slow growth is better than fast growth. And just be mindful of that. I mean, it's just really easy to get over your skis. And next thing you know, you're pumping oysters out there too small, or the quality isn't there. And that's the best way to destroy your brand. So just be careful. And then also just really think about, there are levels in business that make sense in any business. And you can be here and be okay. Be here, be okay, but you can't be in between. So if you're going to go here, you have to have a plan to get there and not be stuck in between here for a long period of time.
Thanks, Jim.
Well, I appreciate all the plugs for PCSGA. I'll reward you appropriately for all of that. But yeah, we would love to see you. We have our annual conference in the first week of September. September 8th is the start date of that. You're all welcome because you're all part of the oyster family. And I will say, working with this group that has so many families involved, families don't always get along, and that's tricky, but it behooves you to get along, to work together, see yourselves as a community that's larger than just the South. You know, you're competitors, that's true, but you have way more to learn from each other than any competition is gonna bring you in benefits. So, but everything else that everyone said too, I completely agree with.
All right. Thanks, Margaret. Thank you to everyone on the panel. If you see these, please go up and ask them questions as you see them. So thank you all.